Every time you see the blue and white propeller logo of a BMW gliding down the highway, you are looking at a symbol of luxury, speed, and German engineering perfection. But beneath that glossy paint lies a foundation not of steel, but of ash. The Quandt family, the silent owners of this automotive empire, are the wealthiest family in Germany, living behind high walls and deeper silences. They hide because their fortune was not built on business acumen alone. It was built on a blood pact with the devil. This is the story of a bloodline that fused with the Third Reich, of a mother who murdered her 6 children in Hitler's bunker, and of an industrial machine that consumed 50,000 slaves to keep its profit margins alive. Welcome to the autopsy of the Quandt dynasty, from war profiteering to Nazi royalty. The dark origins of the Quandt dynasty can be traced back to the textile mills of late 19th century Germany, centered around the imposing figure of Günther Quandt. Born in 1881, Günther was a man who seemed to operate without a moral compass. While his contemporaries viewed the outbreak of World War I as a geopolitical catastrophe, Günther viewed it through the cold lens of logistics. He secured lucrative government contracts to supply uniforms for the Imperial Army, realizing early in his career that the most reliable customer on earth is a government engaged in mass slaughter. As young German men froze to death in the trenches of Verdun, Günther cornered the wool market, driving up prices and siphoning millions of marks from the national treasury. This initial accumulation of capital established the psychological template for the family. Human tragedy is simply a variable to be exploited for industrial gain. The chaos of the Weimar Republic, with its hyperinflation and street violence, served as the perfect incubator for Günther's ambition. He operated as a vulture capitalist, circling dying companies and devouring them for pennies on the dollar. His most critical acquisition during this period was AFA, Accumulatoren Fabrik Aktiengesellschaft, a massive battery manufacturer. To the uninitiated, a battery factory seems mundane. To Günther, it was the beating heart of future warfare. He understood that the submarines, radios, and tanks of the next war would require portable power. By seizing control of AFA, he positioned himself not merely as a businessman, but as an indispensable organ of the state. He did not care which flag flew over the Reichstag, monarchist, democratic, or fascist, so long as the ruler bought his batteries. He was a creature of pure opportunism, a void waiting to be filled by a powerful patron. The narrative takes a sharp turn into the realm of psychological horror with the introduction of Magda Ritschl. In 1920, on a train compartment crossing Germany, the 38-year-old widower Günther laid eyes on the 18-year-old Magda. He did not court her, he targeted her. Their subsequent marriage was a transaction devoid of warmth. Günther needed a trophy wife to host his society salons and manage his estate. Magda sought financial security. From this loveless, sterile union, a son was born in 1921, Harold Quandt. This boy represents the terrifying biological link between the modern BMW fortune and the inner circle of the Nazi elite. He was the genetic bridge between industrial capital and political genocide. The marriage quickly disintegrated. Günther was a miserly, controlling tyrant who counted every pfennig and demanded absolute obedience. Magda, bored, neglected, and yearning for a cause greater than herself, began to drift away. She found her purpose not in the arms of another industrialist, but in the fiery rhetoric of a rising political agitator named Joseph Goebbels. Following her divorce from Günther in 1929, Magda did not fade into obscurity. She ascended to the pinnacle of the Nazi hierarchy, marrying Goebbels and becoming the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich. She worshipped Adolf Hitler with a fanaticism that bordered on religious ecstasy. This creates a historical reality that is difficult to comprehend. Young Harold Quandt, the future heir to the Quandt billions, moved out of his father's house and into the home of Joseph Goebbels. He grew up calling the propaganda minister Papa. He was the boy seen in newsreels standing next to Hitler, wearing a crisp Hitler Youth uniform, his arm raised in a salute. While his biological father, Günther, was busy converting his factories to serve the Nazi war machine, his stepfather was busy engineering the Holocaust. The Quandt bloodline was not merely associated with the Nazis. It was raised in their living room, fed at their table, and indoctrinated by their supreme leaders. While his son was being groomed in the household of the propaganda minister, Günther Quandt was solidifying his alliance with the new regime in the boardroom. When Hitler seized absolute power in 1933, Günther officially joined the Nazi Party, NSDAP. This was not an act of ideological conversion, but a calculated business maneuver. The Nazis offered a program that appealed to Günther's predatory instincts, Aryanization. This was the state-sanctioned theft of Jewish businesses, a legal framework that allowed German industrialists to seize the assets of their Jewish competitors for a fraction of their value. Günther stalked Jewish business owners with the patience of a wolf. He used his political connections to pressure banks to cut off their credit lines, forcing them into bankruptcy. Then he would swoop in as the savior, offering to buy their factories at a ruinous discount. If they refused, the Gestapo would pay them a visit. He acquired construction firms, metalworks, and mining operations, effectively stealing generations of Jewish wealth to expand the Quandt footprint. This was plunder disguised as commerce. By 1937, Hitler honored him with the title of Wehrwirtschaftsführer, leader of the defense economy, a designation that gave him the power of life and death over the industrial landscape. He had ceased to be a civilian manufacturer. He had become a warlord of production. His fortunes now inextricably tied to the success of the Nazi conquest. The psychological compartmentalization required to operate in this manner is staggering. Günther could have dinner with his son Harold at the Goebbels residence discussing the glory of the Reich, and then return to his office to sign orders that would strip a Jewish family of their livelihood. He viewed the Nazi Party not as a criminal organization, but as a management consultant firm that removed labor unions and eliminated competitors. As the war clouds gathered over Europe, Günther Quandt looked at his balance sheets and smiled. The batteries of AFA were about to be installed in every U-boat and V-2 rocket that Germany could produce. The stage was set for the next phase of his expansion, where he would trade money for blood and replace paid workers with a new disposable resource, slaves. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 did not panic the Quandt family, it energized them. While Europe descended into chaos, Günther Quandt looked at the logistical map of the Third Reich and identified a critical bottleneck. The Blitzkrieg relied on speed, but the machinery of war, the U-boats prowling the Atlantic, the V-2 rockets raining terror on London, and the radios coordinating the panzer divisions, all relied on portable energy. They needed batteries. AFA, the jewel of the Quandt Empire, was the only entity capable of meeting this insatiable demand. But there was a problem. The German workforce was being conscripted to fight on the Eastern Front. The factories were expanding, but the labor pool was vanishing. A normal industrialist might have scaled back production. Günther Quandt, the Wehrwirtschaftsführer, chose a different solution, one that required the total suspension of human morality. He accepted the Nazi offer of a new, disposable resource, slave labor. The descent into barbarism was not gradual. It was immediate and structured. The Quandt family did not merely employ forced laborers sent by the state. They actively petitioned the SS for them. They negotiated the contracts for human beings as if they were ordering raw steel or rubber. In 1943, seeking to maximize efficiency, the family established a private concentration camp directly adjacent to their battery factory in Hannoverstücken. This was a satellite of the notorious Neuengamme concentration camp, but for all intents and purposes it was a Quandt fiefdom. It was a closed loop of horror where the factory manager was the god and the prisoner was a biological component with a calculated shelf life. Inside the walls of Hannoverstücken, the true nature of the Quandt fortune was forged. The production of lead-acid batteries is a toxic process. It involves handling heavy metals and inhaling poisonous fumes. In a regulated environment, workers wear protective gear and work short shifts. In the Quandt factory, the slaves wore rags and worked 12-hour shifts without masks. They were exposed to lethal concentrations of lead dust. Forensic accounts from survivors describe a living nightmare where the air tasted of metal. The lead accumulated in their bodies, rotting their teeth, turning their gums a necrotic blue, and attacking their nervous systems. The prisoners did not just die from exhaustion or typhus. They died from acute industrial poisoning, their bodies slowly shutting down as they assembled the power sources for Hitler's submarines. Herbert Quandt, the son of Günther and the future savior of BMW, was not an innocent bystander during this atrocity. By the 1940s, he was a director at AFA, heavily involved in personnel management. Post-war apologetics often try to paint the younger generation as helpless observers, but the paper trail destroys this myth. Herbert knew exactly what was happening on the factory floor. He walked the lines. He saw the walking skeletons. He saw the men coughing up blood. The documents reveal that the management treated the death rate not as a tragedy, but as a logistical variable known as fluctuation. When a batch of slaves was used up, too sick or too weak to work, they were not treated. They were returned to the SS for special handling, execution, and replaced with a fresh shipment. Herbert Quandt oversaw a system of human rotation that mirrored the replacement of a worn-out drill bit. The brutality of the Hannoverstücken camp was distinct because of its calculated indifference. The Quandt managers did not hate the Jews, the Danes, and the French resistance fighters who worked their lines with the fiery passion of a stormtrooper. They viewed them with the cold detachment of a farmer looking at livestock. The prisoners were essentially leased capital. The family paid the SS a daily fee for each head, a fee that was significantly lower than a German worker's wage. They calculated the caloric intake required to keep a man standing versus the output of battery cells. If the math didn't work, the man was discarded. This concept, known in Nazi terminology as Vernichtung durch Arbeit, extermination through labor, was the business model. The profit margins of AFA soared during the war years because their labor cost was effectively reduced to the price of a bowl of watery soup and the eventual cost of body disposal. There is a specific chilling detail that separates the Quandt factories from other industrial collaborators. At the AFA plant, the line between the factory and the execution site dissolved completely. Survivors testified that the company established an execution area on the factory grounds itself. A gallows was erected near the loading docks. When prisoners were caught stealing scraps of food or sabotaging a battery, they were not sent away to a distant camp for punishment. They were hanged right there in front of the assembly line as a lesson in productivity. The Quandt managers watched, they signed the reports, and then they went back to their offices to check the daily production quotas for the Luftwaffe. The connection to the Nazi elite fueled this impunity. While thousands died in his factories, Günter Quandt's biological son, Harold, was serving as a lieutenant in the Luftwaffe, fighting for the regime his stepfather, Joseph Goebbels, helped build. The family was protected by the highest echelons of the party. They were untouchable. As the Allies bombed German cities into rubble, the Quandt factories kept humming, protected by anti-aircraft guns and the blood of the slaves who were forced to repair the bomb damage during the air raids. They were building a fortune that would survive the war, a pile of gold accumulating in the vaults while the bodies piled up in the mass graves outside Hanover. By 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, the Quandt family faced a dilemma. The war was lost. The Soviet army was approaching from the east and the Americans from the west. A normal criminal might try to flee. Günther and Herbert Quandt did something more calculating. They prepared to pivot. They knew that the world would still need batteries, regardless of who won the war. They began to scrub the records. They dismantled the gallows. They sent the surviving slaves on death marches, away from the approaching liberators, hoping that hunger and cold would finish the job and destroy the witnesses. They were preparing for the greatest magic trick of their lives, transforming themselves from Nazi warlords into respectable West German industrialists. They bet on the fact that the world would forget the smell of the lead dust if the price was right. The final act of the Nazi Götterdämmerung played out 30 feet beneath the streets of a burning Berlin, and it is here that the Quandt family history intersects with the darkest moment of the 20th century. On May 1, 1945, inside the Führer bunker, Magda Goebbels, the ex-wife of Günter Quandt and the mother of the Quandt heir, Harold, made a decision that defies biological instinct. With the Soviet army only meters away, Magda and her husband, Joseph Goebbels, decided that a world without National Socialism was not a world worth living in. More terrifyingly, they decided it was not a world their children should live in either. Magda sedated her 6 young children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, and Haida, with morphine. Once they were unconscious, she crushed cyanide capsules between their teeth, extinguishing their lives one by one. This act of filicide serves as the horrific spiritual baseline of the family narrative. However, one child was missing from this slaughter, Harold Quandt. He was Magda's son from her first marriage to Günther, and he was safe in a prisoner of war camp in Benghazi, having been captured by the British. Before she killed herself, Magda wrote a final letter to Harold, a document that serves as a chilling testament to the fanaticism that flowed through his veins. She wrote, "My dear son, our glorious idea is ruined. The world that is coming after the Führer and National Socialism is not any longer worth living in, and therefore I took the children with me. We have only one goal, loyalty unto death." Harold Quandt survived the war as the sole biological remnant of Magda Goebbels, inheriting not only the immense industrial fortune of his father Günther, but also the traumatic, silent legacy of his mother's annihilation. While the bunker burned, Günther Quandt was executing a survival strategy of a different kind. He was arrested by the Americans in July 1946 and interned at the Moosburg camp. To the casual observer, his conviction seemed inevitable. He was a Wehrwirtschaftsführer, a member of the party, and the operator of a private concentration camp. But Günther was a master of the gray zone. He constructed a brilliant fabricated narrative for the denazification tribunals. He painted himself not as a perpetrator, but as a victim, a reluctant businessman forced into cooperation by the regime. He weaponized his animosity with Joseph Goebbels, his ex-wife's husband, to claim that he was actually persecuted by the Nazis. He argued that if he hadn't used slave labor, the SS would have nationalized his factories. The American prosecutors, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of cases and shifting their focus to the looming Cold War against the Soviet Union, accepted this fiction. They classified Günther Quandt as a Mitläufer, a fellow traveler or minor follower, rather than a major offender. He was released in 1948. He faced no prison time for the deaths in Hannover-Stücken. He paid no reparations to the families of the hanged. He walked away from the ashes of Europe with his empire intact, his bank accounts full, and his reputation officially scrubbed clean. This judicial failure is the cornerstone of the modern German economic miracle. It was built on the premise that capital is more important than justice. With his freedom secured, Günther and his son Herbert began the process of the resurrection. They retreated into silence, adopting a strict media blackout that persists to this day. They knew that their money smelled of death, so they needed a new vessel to wash it. They found that vessel in BMW, Bayerische Motorenwerke. In the late 1950s, BMW was a failing company. It had produced aircraft engines for the Luftwaffe during the war, also using slave labor, but in the post-war era, it was on the verge of bankruptcy, surviving by making pots, pans, and the tiny Isetta bubble car. Daimler-Benz was preparing to buy BMW and dismantle it. In 1959, Herbert Quandt made the gamble that would define the rest of the century. Using the blood money accumulated from the battery factories and the slave camps, he bought a controlling stake in BMW. He blocked the sale to Daimler. He injected the capital needed to develop the Neue Klasse sedans, the cars that would save the brand. It was a masterstroke of reputation laundering. By saving a Bavarian icon, the Quandt family transformed themselves from Nazi collaborators into heroes of the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle. The public cheered the revival of BMW. They did not ask where the money came from. The roar of the engines drowned out the whispers of the dead. The final tragedy of this era occurred in 1967. Harold Quandt, the boy who survived the war and inherited the dual burden of the Quandt billions and the Goebbels trauma, was killed. He died in a plane crash in Italy, slamming into a mountainside in his private aircraft. His death left the empire in the hands of his half-brother Herbert and their respective children. But even in death, the silence held. The family did not open the archives. They did not speak of the mother in the bunker or the slaves in the battery plant. They simply continued to compound their wealth, protected by a wall of lawyers and the complicity of a nation that wanted to forget. By the time Herbert Quandt died in 1982, he was eulogized as a visionary industrialist, the man who saved BMW. His casket was not followed by the ghosts of Hannover-Stücken. It was followed by politicians and bankers who celebrated his genius. The whitewash was complete. The pact with the devil had been fulfilled. The family had traded their souls for a dynasty, and thanks to the collective amnesia of the West, they were allowed to keep the receipt. But history is a patient prosecutor. The bodies buried under the factory floor do not disappear. They simply wait for the earth to shift. And in the 21st century, the ground was about to crack open. How a TV documentary finally exposed the 50,000 dead slaves. The decades following World War II in West Germany were defined by a psychological phenomenon known as the Great Silence. It was a collective national agreement to look forward, never backward, to rebuild the cities without asking too many questions about who had burned them down. No family embodied this selective amnesia more perfectly than the Quandts. From the moment the Nuremberg trials ended until the turn of the millennium, the dynasty operated like a cult of secrecy. They were the invisible monarchs of the new German Republic, their influence woven into the very chassis of the nation's economic recovery. Yet their faces remained hidden. They gave no interviews. They attended no public galas. They allowed no unauthorized biographies. This was not modesty. It was a tactical necessity. They knew that their empire was a sepulcher, and if they let the light in, the bones would start to scream. Herbert Quandt, the man who had walked the killing floors of the battery factories and watched slaves hang from the gallows, became the architect of this new reality. Physically, Herbert was failing. A degenerative eye disease was slowly robbing him of his sight, turning the world into shadows. But metaphorically, his blindness was willful. He constructed a hermetically sealed world for his family in Bad Homburg, a fortress of privilege where the word Nazi was never spoken. He raised his children, Suzanne Clotten and Stefan Quandt, in a vacuum of history. They grew up knowing they were rich, knowing they were powerful, but having absolutely no concept of the true source of their inheritance. They were taught that their grandfather Gunther was a brilliant industrialist who had navigated difficult times, a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator of genocide. This gaslighting of the next generation was the ultimate act of preservation. By keeping his heirs innocent, Herbert ensured that they would defend the family legacy with the righteous indignation of the unknowingly guilty. The vehicle for this reputation laundering was BMW. When Herbert Quandt saved the company from bankruptcy in 1959, he didn't just buy a car manufacturer, he bought a new identity. The launch of the Neue Klasse, new class sedans, in the 1960s was symbolic of the family's own transformation. These cars were sleek, modern, and technically flawless. They represented the future, speed, efficiency, and freedom. They were the perfect distraction. Every time a shiny BMW 1500 rolled off the assembly line in Munich, it put another layer of chrome over the memory of the slaves in Hanover. The world fell in love with the ultimate driving machine, and in doing so, they unknowingly funded the retirement of the men who had armed the Wehrmacht. The brilliance of the Quandt strategy was to equate their personal success with the success of West Germany itself. To attack the Quandts was to attack the economic miracle. They wrapped themselves in the flag of democracy while counting the profits of fascism. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the silence held. But it required constant vigilance. The family maintained a phalanx of lawyers whose sole job was to suppress inquiry. When journalists sniffed around the edges of the AFA battery history, they were met with threats of libel suits or stonewalled by a lack of documentation. The family had destroyed the most incriminating records in the final days of the war, leaving a paper trail that was deliberately incomplete. They relied on the fact that the survivors, the few slaves who hadn't been worked to death, were scattered, poor, and traumatized. Who would believe a ragged survivor from Ukraine over the wealthiest family in Europe? The power dynamic was so lopsided that the truth didn't stand a chance. The burden of this silence began to warp the family dynamics. Herbert Quandt became a recluse, a phantom of Bad Homburg, governing his empire by telephone and proxy. He knew that one slip, one honest answer, could bring the whole facade crashing down. He died in 1982, taking the secrets to his grave, leaving the empire to his widow, Johanna, and his children. Suzanne and Stefan inherited billions, but they also inherited a ticking time bomb. They were now the custodians of a lie they didn't even fully understand. They walked into boardrooms as the major shareholders of BMW, revered as royalty, completely unaware that the foundation of their throne was a mass grave. They were the unintentional heirs of a crime against humanity, protected by a firewall of money that was about to be breached by the one thing their father couldn't kill, the archives. The 1990s brought the first cracks in the dam. The unification of Germany opened up the archives of the former East Germany. Suddenly, documents that had been locked away behind the Iron Curtain were available to historians. Researchers began to piece together the fragments of the Third Reich's industrial machinery. They found requisition orders signed by Quandt managers. They found transport manifests for slaves. They found death reports. The ghosts were beginning to stir, but the family, led by the matriarch Johanna, held the line. They issued vague statements about forced labor being a tragedy of the era, using the passive voice to distance themselves from agency. They claimed they were no different from Volkswagen or Siemens, hiding in the herd of guilt. They didn't realize that a storm was gathering, and it would arrive not in a courtroom, but on a television screen. The fortress of silence that the Quandt family had meticulously constructed for 60 years was not breached by a government subpoena, a corporate whistleblower, or a sudden pang of conscience from within the dynasty. It was demolished by a television signal. For decades, the family had operated under a cloak of invisibility, managing their devastating history with a combination of aggressive litigation and strategic philanthropy. They believed that time was their ally, that as the survivors of the concentration camps died of old age, the evidence of the family's crimes would decay along with the bodies. They were wrong. On a quiet evening in October 2007, the German public broadcaster ARD aired a documentary titled Das Schweigen der Quandts, The Silence of the Quandts. To the forensic historian, this was not merely a film, it was a televised exhumation. It was a 90-minute autopsy of the German industrial soul, performed in front of millions of viewers who had spent their lives driving BMWs and admiring the Quandt family from afar. The filmmakers, Eric Friedler and Barbara Siebert, had approached the project with the tenacity of cold case detectives. They understood that the official archives had been scrubbed by Günther and Herbert Quandt in the final days of the war. They knew that the corporate records were locked in the family's private vaults in Bad Homburg, so they went to the only archive the family could not burn, the living memory of the victims. They traveled across Europe and into the Levant, tracking down the last surviving slave laborers of the Hannoverstücken and Neuengamme concentration camps. These men, now in their 80s, living in modest apartments in Copenhagen, Athens, and Tel Aviv, became the prosecutors of the Quandt legacy. They did not speak with the rage of the vengeful. They spoke with the hollow, haunting precision of witnesses who had stared into the abyss of capitalistic cruelty and survived to tell the tale. When the documentary aired, the contrast presented on the screen was visceral and nauseating. The editors utilized a split-screen narrative technique that served as a moral indictment. On one side of the frame, the audience saw archival footage of Suzanne Klatten and Stefan Quandt, the modern heirs. They were depicted in their natural habitat, christening new luxury yachts, attending black-tie opera galas, and sitting in the sterile, air-conditioned boardrooms of BMW, looking every inch the respectable captains of industry. They were the golden children of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. On the other side of the frame, the film cut to the grainy nightmare footage of the AFA battery factories in 1943. The viewers saw the walking skeletons, the men with hollow eyes and shaved heads, shuffling through the lead dust, manufacturing the batteries that fueled the Nazi war machine. The visual juxtaposition shattered the myth that the Quandt fortune was distinct from the Nazi crimes. The film argued visually and forensically that the champagne in Suzanne Klatten's glass was paid for by the marrow of the men dying on the other side of the screen. The testimony of the survivors provided the specific gruesome details that the family had spent millions to suppress. A Greek survivor, Takis Mylopoulos, described the conditions inside the factory of bones with a clarity that silenced the nation. He described how the Quandt managers, civilians, not SS officers, walked the production lines with stopwatches, treating the slaves not as human beings, but as biological batteries with a calculated shelf life. He spoke of the lead death, the sweet metallic taste in the mouth that signaled the beginning of the end. As the prisoners inhaled the toxic dust without protective gear, their gums would turn blue, their teeth would rot and fall out, and their nervous systems would collapse. The documentary revealed that the Quandt management had calculated the exact caloric intake required to keep a man standing for 12 hours of labor. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion or lead poisoning, he was not sent to a hospital. He was sent to the death zone to be liquidated and replaced by a fresh shipment from the Neuengamme main camp. Perhaps the most damaging revelation was the exposure of the Quandt execution ground. The filmmakers uncovered evidence that the family had erected a gallows on the factory premises, a private killing field designed to enforce discipline through terror. This was a critical forensic detail. It proved that the atrocities were not happening over there in some distant SS-run camp for which the family could claim ignorance. The murders were happening inside the business, visible from the office windows where Herbert Quandt sat reviewing production quotas. The documentary proved that Herbert, the man eulogized as the savior of BMW, was personally responsible for the personnel management of a death camp. He had walked the lines, he had seen the blue gums, he had signed the requisition orders for more bodies. Throughout the production of the film, the filmmakers had attempted to engage the family. They sent letters, made phone calls, and requested interviews. They were met with the standard Quandt response, a wall of silence. The family's handlers, accustomed to bullying the press, assumed that ignoring the project would make it go away. This was a fatal miscalculation. In the visual language of the documentary, the empty chair became the loudest voice in the room. The filmmakers repeatedly showed the unanswered letters and the closed gates of the family estate. This refusal to speak transformed the Quandts in the public eye. They were no longer viewed as private, dignified aristocrats. They were revealed as cowardly accomplices, happy to spend the blood money, but too frightened to look the victims in the eye. The silence was no longer a shield. It was an admission of guilt. The reaction in Germany was seismic. The morning after the broadcast, the nation woke up with a collective moral hangover. For decades, the German public had bought into the comforting lie of the good industrialist, the idea that business leaders like the Quandts were merely caught up in the machinery of the totalitarian state, distinct from the fanatical SS killers. The silence of the Quandts vaporized this myth. It demonstrated that the industrialist was often worse than the soldier. The soldier might kill for ideology. The Quandts killed for a quarterly earnings report. The moral injury to the BMW brand was profound. The logo, a symbol of Bavarian pride and engineering excellence, was suddenly stained with the invisible blood of 50,000 slaves. Questions began to pour in from every sector of society. How could the richest family in Germany not have a single memorial for their victims? How could they sit on the boards of cultural foundations while ignoring the men they enslaved? For the heirs, Susanna Klatten and Stefan Quandt, the broadcast was a psychological catastrophe that pierced their bubble of privilege. Reports from within their inner circle suggest that the family watched the documentary in a state of shock. For their entire lives, they had been subjected to a sophisticated form of parental gaslighting. Herbert Quandt had raised them in a vacuum of history, protecting them from the truth of his own sins. They knew their grandfather was a member of the party, but they viewed it as a bureaucratic necessity. They did not know he was a monster who stole Jewish companies. They knew their father ran the battery factories, but they did not know he presided over a system of extermination through labor. The documentary forced a mirror in front of their faces, and the reflection was hideous. They looked at their vast inheritance, the billions in stock, the mansions, the art collections, and realized that it was all poisoned fruit. The cognitive dissonance within the family was immense. Suzanne Clatton, a woman known for her discipline and her attempts to lead a normal life despite her wealth, found herself cast in the role of a villain by inheritance. The public anger was personal. Protesters began to appear outside the BMW headquarters. The Jewish Claims Conference and various survivor advocacy groups demanded answers. The family realized that the great silence was untenable. They were trapped in a corner of history. If they continued to deny the findings, they risked becoming pariahs in the global business community. If they attacked the filmmakers, they would look like bullies attacking the victims a second time. The film also exposed the terrifying biological connection to the Nazi elite that the family had tried to bury. The documentary reminded the world that Harold Quandt, the half-brother of Herbert and the uncle of the current heirs, was the son of Magda Goebbels. It showed footage of young Harold in the Goebbels household, standing next to Hitler, the royal child of the Third Reich. This genetic link to the ultimate evil of the 20th century, combined with the industrial crimes of the battery factories, created a narrative that was impossible to spin. The Quandts were not just bystanders, they were the royalty of the regime. As the credits rolled on that October evening, the carefully manicured reputation of the Quandt dynasty lay in ruins. The documentary had done what the Nuremberg trials failed to do. It delivered a verdict in the court of public opinion. The ghosts of Hanover Stücken had finally climbed over the high walls of Bad Homburg. They were standing in the living room of the richest family in Germany, pointing their skeletal fingers at the heirs, demanding an accounting. The silence was broken, and the sound that replaced it was the deafening roar of a history that refused to stay buried. The family had a choice. They could retreat further into their fortress and wait for the storm to pass, or they could do the one thing a Quandt had never done in history. They could open the archives and confess. The weeks following the broadcast of The Silence of the Quandts were a period of intense, paralyzed crisis within the fortress of Bad Homburg. For the first time in the history of the dynasty, the strategy of Omerta, the code of absolute silence, had failed. The documentary had not just embarrassed the family, it had morally bankrupted them in the eyes of the global public. The BMW brand, the shiny armor that had protected the family for 50 years, was beginning to corrode. Shareholders were asking questions. Jewish organizations were demanding an accounting. The German press was relentless. The heirs, Suzanne Clatton and Stefan Quandt, faced an existential binary choice. They could continue to deny the undeniable and risk becoming international pariahs, or they could engage in a high-stakes gamble of transparency. They chose the latter, not out of a sudden burst of altruism, but out of a desperate need to control the narrative of their own damnation. In a move that forensic historians view as a masterstroke of crisis management, the family announced that they would open their private archives for the first time. They hired an independent historian, Professor Joachim Schultisek of the University of Bonn, to conduct a scholarly audit of the family's activities during the Third Reich. This was a calculated risk. By hiring a reputable academic rather than a corporate lawyer, they were signaling to the world that they were ready to face the truth, however ugly. But it was also a containment strategy. By commissioning a multi-year study, they effectively bought themselves time. For the next 3 years, whenever a journalist asked a difficult question about the slaves in the battery factories, the family could simply reply, "We are waiting for the historian's report." It was a way to defer judgment, to place the ghosts in a holding pattern, while the PR machinery prepared for the impact. When Joachim Schultisek entered the Quandt family vaults, he found a paper trail that was more incriminating than anyone had anticipated. While Gunther and Herbert had destroyed many sensitive documents in 1945, their obsessive Teutonic record-keeping had betrayed them. The archives were filled with letters, diaries, and memos that painted a portrait of enthusiastic collaboration. Schultisek found proof that Gunther Quandt was not a victim of the Nazis, as he had claimed during the denazification trials, but a radicalized opportunist who actively courted the regime. He found the minutes of meetings where the acquisition of Jewish companies was discussed with the cold, predatory logic of a takeover artist. He found the correspondence regarding the slave laborers, documents that discussed human beings in terms of depreciation and disposal. The historian realized he was not just writing a biography, he was compiling a posthumous indictment for crimes against humanity. The results of this investigation were released in 2011 in a massive 1,200-page study titled The Rise of the Quandts. The release was a media event, a public confession orchestrated to look like repentance. The findings were devastating. The report confirmed every allegation made in the documentary and went further. It concluded that the Quandt business empire was inextricably linked to the crimes of the Nazis. It confirmed that Gunther Quandt was a part of the regime's elite, a man who used his connections to Magda Goebbels to secure lucrative contracts in slave labor. It confirmed that Herbert Quandt was fully complicit in the horrors of the Hannover-Stucken camp. The report stripped away the last vestiges of the good industrialist myth. It laid bare the reality that the foundation of the modern BMW fortune was built on a slurry of blood, lead, and stolen gold. The reaction of the heirs to their own paid confession was a study in cognitive dissonance. Stefan Quandt and Suzanne Klatten appeared before the press, looking somber and chastened. They expressed their deep regret and shame over the actions of their father and grandfather. Stefan Quandt admitted, "We were treated to a sugar-coated version of the truth." It was a moment of public vulnerability that was rare for the dynasty. However, the forensic eye looks beyond the tears and the apologies to the financial reality. While the heirs expressed shame, they did not express a desire to divest. They did not offer to return the companies stolen from Jewish families during the Aryanization period. They did not offer to give up the billions in compounded interest generated from the slave labor. The family announced a donation of 5 million euros to a project memorializing the victims of forced labor. To the average citizen, this sounds like a significant sum. To the forensic accountant, it is a rounding error. The combined wealth of the Quandt family at the time was estimated to be over 30 billion euros. 5 million euros represented approximately 0.01% of their net worth. It was the equivalent of a normal person donating $10 to apologize for a murder. Critics argued that this was not reparations. It was an indulgence payment, a small fee paid to the church of public opinion to absolve them of their sins so they could go back to business as usual. The apology was transactional. It allowed them to say, "We have acknowledged the past," and then immediately pivot to, "Now let's talk about the future of the 7 series." The release of the report also highlighted the troubling psychology of inherited innocence. Suzanne Klatten, in interviews following the release, struggled to reconcile the monster in the history books with the father she loved. She spoke of Herbert Quandt as a loving parent, a man who read her bedtime stories, completely dissociating him from the man who managed a death camp. This compartmentalization is the survival mechanism of the dynasty. To fully accept the horror of the source of their wealth would be to destroy their own identities. They have to believe that the money has been cleaned by time, that their stewardship of BMW and their philanthropy in modern Germany somehow balances the scales. They live in a state of suspended moral animation, floating on a sea of wealth that they know is toxic, yet refusing to swim to shore. The 2011 confession served its intended purpose. It lanced the boil. The press coverage eventually died down. The protesters went home. The BMW brand survived the scandal, its reputation dented but not destroyed. The world, addicted to German engineering and luxury, was all too willing to accept the apology and move on. The silence of the Quandts was replaced by the managed narrative of the Quandts. They had successfully transformed a hidden crime into a historical footnote. They had admitted to the genocide, framed it as a tragedy of a bygone era, and inoculated themselves against further attacks. But to the forensic historian, the case is never truly closed. The study proved that the capital which saved BMW in 1959 was blood money. That capital has never been separated from the company. It is in the factories, in the R&D centers, and in the dividends paid to the shareholders today. Every BMW on the road contains the DNA of that original sin. The Quandt family proved that in the world of high finance you can get away with murder if you wait long enough to confess. They kept the money, they kept the power, they kept the company, and the ghosts of Hannoverstücken, though finally acknowledged in a 1,200-page book, remain uncompensated, their unpaid wages fueling one of the greatest fortunes of the 21st century. The grave spoke, but the bank accounts remained silent. €1 billion a year in dividends, but no reparations. In the rolling hills of Bad Homburg, a wealthy enclave just north of Frankfurt, sits the nerve center of the modern German economy. It is not a skyscraper or a government ministry, but a heavily fortified compound, shielded from the public gaze by high walls, advanced surveillance systems, and a phalanx of private security. This is the seat of the Quandt dynasty, the home of Susanne Klatten and Stefan Quandt, the grandchildren of the Nazi warlord Günther. They are the wealthiest siblings in Germany, possessing a combined fortune that fluctuates between 30 and 40 billion euros. But to the forensic observer, they are not merely billionaires. They are the shadow monarchs of the Federal Republic, wielding a quiet, terrifying influence over the industrial and political landscape of Europe. They are the living proof that in the game of dynastic capitalism, the crimes of the grandfather are not visited upon the grandchildren as a punishment, but as a tax-free inheritance. Susanne Klatten, the older of the two, is a figure of fascinating psychological contradiction. She is the richest woman in Germany, yet she has spent her entire life trying to be invisible. As a young woman terrified that her identity would attract kidnappers or fortune hunters, a fear rooted in a foiled attempt to abduct her mother in 1978, she worked under the pseudonym Susanne Quandt. She interned at banks and factories, stacking shelves and filing papers, creating a fictitious persona to experience a reality that her bloodline had denied her. This desire for anonymity is the defining pathology of the modern Quandts. They live in a gilded cage of their own design, insulated from the consequences of their history and the struggles of the common citizen. They view the public not as a community to engage with, but as a threat to be managed. This isolation has bred a specific kind of aristocratic detachment. In rare interviews, Clatton has famously complained that it is not easy to be a billionaire, a statement of such breathtaking tone deafness that it reveals the extent of her disconnect. She views the stewardship of the blood money not as a privilege, but as a heavy cross she must bear for the nation. While they shun the limelight, their presence in the corridors of power is undeniable. The Quandt family operates as a massive political gravity well. They are historically among the largest individual donors to the Christian Democratic Union, CDU, the party of former Chancellor Angela Merkel. Forensic political analysts track these donations with the precision of following a blood trail. The timing is often suspicious. In October 2013, just days after the European Union delayed the implementation of stricter emission standards for luxury cars, a ruling that saved BMW hundreds of millions of euros, the Quandt family donated 690,000 euros to the CDU. The public outcry was immediate, with watchdog groups labeling it a legalized bribe. But the family remained silent, and the checks cleared. This incident proved that the operational DNA of the dynasty had not mutated since the days of Günther Quandt. Just as the grandfather paid the Nazis to secure battery contracts, the grandchildren pay the Democratic parties to secure regulatory loopholes. The regime changes, but the strategy of purchasing the state remains constant. The source of this power is the family's iron grip on BMW. Despite BMW being a publicly traded company, the Quandt family holds a blocking minority stake of nearly 47%. This means that in the boardroom in Munich, nothing happens without their permission. They are not passive investors living off the interest. They are the active rulers of the empire. They appoint the CEOs, they approve the designs, and they set the strategy. This control allows them to extract wealth on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. In a good year, the family receives over 1 billion euros in dividends. To visualize this, forensic accountants point out that the Quandts earn more in a single year of doing nothing than the total amount of reparations paid to the Nazi slave laborers in the entire history of the company. The dividend checks arrive annually, clean and laundered, washed of the lead dust and the Zyklon B by the passage of time and the mechanisms of the stock market. This immense wealth has created a reality distortion field around the heirs. Stefan Quandt, a quieter figure than his sister, manages a sprawling portfolio of other investments, from homeopathy to logistics, further diversifying the family's hold on the German economy. They exist in a stratosphere where the laws of gravity do not apply. When the global financial crisis of 2008 hit, or when the Dieselgate scandal rocked the German auto industry, the Quandts remained untouched. Their fortune is so vast that it acts as a shock absorber against reality. They are the untouchables, protected by a firewall of lawyers, lobbyists, and PR consultants who ensure that the name Quandt is associated with innovation and philanthropy, not genocide and slavery. However, this fortress of solitude comes with a psychological cost. The forensic profile of Suzanne Clatton reveals a woman deeply lonely within her tower, raised in a culture of secrecy, taught to trust no one, and burdened with a secret history of atrocities. She developed a vulnerability that is common among the isolated ultra-rich. The paranoia that kept her safe also kept her empty. She had the money to buy anything in the world except the certainty that she was loved for herself and not her checkbook. This psychological fracture, the deep-seated insecurity of the heiress, would eventually become the entry point for a predator. The fortress walls were high enough to keep out the historians and the journalists, but they were not high enough to keep out a man who understood exactly what the richest woman in Germany was starving for. The stage was set for a scandal that would humiliatingly strip away the family's carefully curated privacy and reveal the human fragility beneath the armor of the billionaire. In the summer of 2007, just months before the documentary The Silence of the Quandts would shatter the family's historical reputation, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding in the private life of Suzanne Clatton. This crisis did not involve Nazi archives or slave labor. It involved the raw, unpolished vulnerability of a woman who had spent 40 years living inside a fortress. The incident began at the Lanzerhof, a hyper-exclusive wellness resort in the Austrian Tyrol. This is where the European elite go to detoxify their bodies and inadvertently expose their souls. It was here that Suzanne Clatton, the richest woman in Germany, met Helge Scarby, a man who forensic psychologists would later classify as a master predator of the lonely. Helge Scarby was not a businessman, he was a mirror. Tall, handsome, and impeccably dressed, he possessed the chameleon-like ability to reflect the deepest desires of his targets. He bore the nickname the Swiss James Bond, a persona he carefully cultivated. He approached Clatton not with the deference of a subordinate, but with the intrigue of an equal. He spun a fantastical narrative about his life, claiming to be a special representative for the Swiss government, a man who negotiated hostage releases in war zones. To Clatton, whose life was defined by the sterile, predictable rhythms of boardrooms and security details, Scarby represented danger, excitement, and, most fatally, intimacy. For the first time in decades, someone was looking at her not as an heiress, but as a woman. The seduction was an act of psychological engineering. Scarby identified the void in Clatton's life, the crushing isolation of her wealth, and filled it with attention. They began meeting in secret, in cheap hotels that stood in stark contrast to Clatton's palaces. The primary crime scene was room 629 of the Holiday Inn in Munich. To the forensic observer, the banality of the location is significant. Scarby chose it not for privacy, but for control. It was a neutral ground where the billionaire was stripped of her entourage and her power. But unknown to Clatton, the room was a stage. Next door in room 630 sat Scarby's accomplice, an Italian cult leader named Ernano Beretta. Through a modified peephole in the connecting door, Beretta filmed every intimate encounter, capturing the naked vulnerability of the BMW heiress on grainy video. This was not a romance. It was an entrapment operation planned with military precision. The sting entered its financial phase quickly. Scarby, playing the role of the tragic hero, told Clatton a harrowing story. He claimed that during a mission in Florida, he had accidentally paralyzed the child of a mafia boss in a car accident. He said the mafia was demanding blood money to spare his life. The sum required was 7 million euros. To a normal person, this story is absurd. To Susanna Clatton, who lived in a world of high-stakes negotiations and kidnappings, it was plausible. More importantly, her judgment was chemically impaired by the dopamine rush of the affair. She drove to the basement garage of the Holiday Inn and handed Scarby a cardboard box filled with 7 million euros in 500 euro notes. This was the test transaction. Scarby was testing the liquidity of his asset and the depth of her submission. However, the predator got greedy. Emboldened by the ease of the first theft, Scarby escalated. He demanded Clatton leave her husband and invest hundreds of millions into a fictitious trust fund. When Clatton finally hesitated, sensing that the fairy tale was fracturing, Scarby dropped the mask. The charming Swiss diplomat vanished, replaced by the cold-blooded extortionist. He sent her copies of the sex tapes. He attached a letter demanding 49 million euros, later negotiated down, then up again. The threat was explicit: pay the money, or the videos would be sent to the BMW board of directors, her husband, and the international press. He threatened to destroy her reputation, the only thing the Quandt family valued as much as their money. This is the moment where the forensic profile of Suzanne Clatton shifts. A weaker victim, terrified of the shame, would have paid. The Quandt family certainly had the liquidity to make the problem disappear. 49 million euros was merely a fraction of their annual dividend payout, a sum they could lose without blinking. But Scarby had miscalculated the nature of his prey. He forgot that Suzanne Clatton was the granddaughter of Günther Quandt. Beneath the vulnerability lay a core of cold ruthlessness steel. She realized she was being enslaved, just as her grandfather had enslaved workers, and a Quandt does not submit to slavery. They impose it. In a move that stunned the German public, Clatton went to the police. She chose the humiliation of a public scandal over the humiliation of ongoing blackmail. She worked with the Munich prosecutors to set a trap. Under the guidance of police tacticians, she arranged a final meeting with Scarby at a highway rest stop in Austria. When Scarby arrived expecting another cardboard box of cash, he was swarmed by a tactical unit of the German Special Police, SEK. The Swiss James Bond was dragged out of his luxury car and thrown onto the asphalt. The subsequent trial in 2009 was a spectacle of schadenfreude for the German public. Scarby, arrogant to the end, refused to reveal where the original 7 million euros had gone. It has never been recovered. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but for Suzanne Clatton, the verdict was a Pyrrhic victory. The trial forced her into the witness box, where the most intimate details of her loneliness were dissected by the tabloids. The Shadow Queen was dragged into the light. The scandal stripped away the aura of invincibility that surrounded the family. It revealed that beneath the billions, the political influence, and the historical silence, the heirs were profoundly damaged human beings. Clatton had tried to buy love just as her family bought companies, and she had been scammed. The Scarby affair served as a grim bookend to the historical revelations of the same year. In 2007, the public learned that the Quandt fortune was built on death. In 2008, they learned that the current custodian of that fortune was trapped in a gilded cage of misery. It proved that the Quandt curse was real. The money extracted from the suffering of others did not bring happiness. It brought a paralyzing isolation that made the richest woman in Germany an easy mark for a hotel gigolo. The 7 million euros she lost in that garage was not just cash. It was a tax on her soul, a down payment on the realization that no amount of wealth can fill the void left by a legacy of inhumanity. In the cool, detached arithmetic of global finance, there is a singular date that matters more to the Quandt family than any historical anniversary or memorial service: the annual BMW Annual General Meeting. It is here, usually in May, that the Board of Management proposes the dividend payout for the fiscal year. To the forensic accountant, this event is not merely a corporate ritual. It is the harvesting of the crop planted by Günther Quandt in 1933. In recent years, the dividend payout to the Quandt family, specifically to Suzanne Clatton and Stefan Quandt, has hovered consistently around 1 billion euros per year. In 2018 alone, a year when the family was still ostensibly atoning for its past, they collected 1.1 billion euros in cash. This is not net worth or stock valuation. This is liquid capital deposited directly into their private accounts, tax-advantaged and clean. Put that figure under a microscope, and the insult becomes clear. The 5 million euros they tossed at the memorial fund was not a sacrifice. It was a rounding error. It represented merely 2 days of the family's passive income. They effectively paid a weekend's worth of pocket money to wash their hands of 50,000 dead slaves. This wasn't a reparation, it was a tip. It proves that the blood money was never returned. It was compounded. The capital that bought BMW in 1959 was born in the concentration camps, and every dividend check printed today still carries that genetic code. The Quandts proved a dark rule of history. If you steal enough money and hold on to it long enough, theft eventually becomes heritage. With their billions secured, the heirs have engaged in a sophisticated campaign of reputation laundering through philanthropy. This is a standard maneuver for dynasties built on crime, from the Rockefellers to the Sacklers. Suzanne Clatton and Stefan Quandt have plastered their names on university chairs, art prizes, and foundation boards. They are celebrated as patrons of the sciences and the arts. This strategy serves a dual purpose. First, it buys silence. It is difficult for a university president or a museum director to criticize the family's Nazi past when the Quandt Foundation is paying for the new wing of the building. Second, it rewrites the narrative. It replaces the image of the slave driver with the image of the benefactor. But the forensic eye notices what they do not fund. There is no Quandt scholarship for the descendants of the Greek or Russian slave laborers. There is no Herbert Quandt Hospital in the cities their batteries helped destroy. Their charity is domestic, safe, and designed to bolster their standing within the German elite. It is a hush money payment to society, a small tax paid to ensure that they are invited to the state dinners and the opera premieres. They have successfully reintegrated themselves into the polite society of Europe, proving that there is no crime so heinous that €1 billion cannot smooth over the edges. The stain of the Holocaust has not been removed. It has simply been gilded. The ultimate accomplice in this great forgetting is the product itself. The BMW automobile is a masterpiece of distraction. When a consumer sits behind the wheel of a 7 Series, surrounded by hand-stitched leather and the hum of a precision-engineered motor, they are seduced by the present. The sensory experience of the car overpowers the intellectual knowledge of its history. The brand is so strong, so desirable, that it acts as a moral anesthetic. We, the consumers, do not want to think about the lead dust in the lungs of the AFA slaves. We want to think about the horsepower. The Quandt family relies on this consumer complicity. They know that the market has no memory. They know that luxury is the ultimate amnesiac. This creates a disturbing feedback loop. By buying the cars, the world continues to enrich the heirs of the men who built the batteries for the V2 rockets. We are, in a forensic sense, financing the 4th generation of the dynasty. Stefan Quandt's children and Suzanne Clatton's children are currently being raised in the same bubble of privilege, likely shielded from the gritty details of the documentary The Silence of the Quandts, just as their parents were shielded before them. The cycle continues. The money protects the family, and the family protects the money. The Quandt curse, the trauma, the suicides, the blackmail is the price they pay in private, but in public, they remain the untouchable monarchs of German industry. As we close the file on the Quandt dynasty, the verdict of history is chillingly clear. Justice in the conventional sense was never served. Günther Quandt died a free man in Cairo, on a vacation, not in a prison cell. Herbert Quandt died hailed as a visionary, not condemned as a slaver. The heirs, Suzanne and Stefan, sit atop a mountain of gold that is higher than any in Europe. The victims, the men who were hanged at the Hanover gallows, the women who died in the gas chambers powered by Quandt batteries, the children poisoned by Magda Goebbels, are dust. The story of the Quandt family is a testament to the terrifying resilience of capital. It proves that in the modern world, property rights are held more sacred than human rights. It proves that you can collaborate with the devil, profit from genocide, and as long as you survive the initial fallout and hire the right lawyers, you can keep the proceeds. The silence of the Quandts was not just a refusal to speak, it was a weapon. It was a waiting game, and they won. They waited until the witnesses died. They waited until the outrage faded. They waited until the world was distracted by the next shiny object. It was a grotesque irony. Her grandfather had extracted value from human bodies in a factory. Now, a predator was extracting value from her body in a cheap hotel room. The methods were different, but the transactional coldness was exactly the same. Today, the skeletons in the family closet have been cataloged in a 1,200-page book that sits on library shelves, gathering dust. The family acknowledged them, nodded solemnly, and then went back to work. The engine of the BMW roars on, drowning out the whispers of the past. The Quandt dynasty stands as a monolith to a singular dark truth of the 20th century. The statute of limitations on murder may expire, but the statute of limitations on profit is eternal.